Good afternoon. Today we're going to start our discussion of Islam. We'll do that in a number of ways, but I want to prep you for what we'll do on Friday. So if your last name begins with the letters A through L, you will be responsible for teaching the other half of the classroom the Lincoln reading. If your last name begins with the letters M through Z, you will be responsible for teaching the other half of the class, the Gilkey's reading. Everyone is responsible for reading Turner. So again, if your last name begins with the letters A through L, you'll need to teach the rest of your classmates the Lincoln reading. And if your last name begins with the letters M through Z, you'll need to teach your classmates the Gilkey's reading, and everyone reads Turner. I'll be back on Friday, and we will proceed with those readings at that time. But what I want to do to start is to have you take a minute to write down everything you can recall that you know about Islam. Take out a piece of paper, write everything that comes to mind, and then I'll have the person I've assigned to do this in class get your ideas, put them up on the board, and compare what you know with what I will then discuss. But pause the video now and spend a minute writing down what you know and then putting up what the whole class knows on the whiteboard. Okay, welcome back. I'm sure you came up with a great list. All right, let's talk about some general points of overview about Islam. First, we have to note that Islam has its roots in Abraham. The Islamic community traces their religious roots back to the Abrahamic tradition. The nation arose according to their narrative from Abraham, Hagar, and their offspring, Ishmael. The holy book of the Islamic community is the Quran. Various spellings of how that book is referenced in English, both Koran and Qur''an. Either is considered standard. The belief of the community is that the Holy Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in or around 570 CE. Muhammad himself was illiterate at the time, which served to imbue the Quran with miraculous status, because how else could the words, such beautiful words, come from an unlettered man? In the story, the angel Gabriel reveals the Quran to Muhammad, a man who is considered a holy prophet in the line of Moses and Jesus, but is not himself considered divine. The Quran was assembled in its final form about 18 years after Muhammad's death. Muhammad died in 632 of the Common Era. Within the Islamic community, as in many other religions, there are distinct groups. The largest of those groups in Islam are the Sunnis. In the US, Sunnis make up about 85% of the Islamic population. Other groups include the Shia, which makes up about 15% of Muslims in the United States. And just as a point of background, Shiites also follow the teachings of Muhammad, as do the Sunnis, but they also, in addition to that, follow the teaching of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, and many of those followers are found particularly in Iran and Iraq. An extremist assassinated Ali in 1661, and the Sunnis in turn assassinated his son Hussein in 680. Sunnis are characterized by a considered orthodoxy and are the largest Muslim group not only in the United States, but in the world as well. A smaller percentage of American Muslims belong to the Sufi sect, a mystical group that emphasizes self-purification and who have attracted some white adherents from the New Age community because of those mystical elements. Worldwide, there are about 1 billion Islamic adherents, equals at least 1 out of every 5 people on the planet. That's a 2006 statistic, and those numbers have grown since that time. Christian groups currently are still slightly larger, with approximately 1.2 billion adherents, but the growth rate of Islam may make it larger yet. In the United States, somewhere between 3 and 10 million adherents are members of the Muslim community. 6 million is considered an accepted figure, although as I note, the figures vary. Of those, about 30%, or approximately 1.7 million, the second largest group of Islamic adherents, are African American. By comparison, the American Jewish population is about 6 million, so the Islamic community in the United States is smaller. Most available statistics point to about 1,300 mosques and hundreds of Islamic schools in the US, but they are growing at a rate of about 20,000 per year of US conversions, as well as from immigration. Within the United States, there are currently about 17 distinct, separate Islamic communities. So as I said, not only those major differentiations of Sunnis, Sufis, and Shia, but many other small groups as well that we won't go into detail at this time. Now, we do need to note that the Islamic community, and the Quran in particular, hosts a great deal of respect for the person of Jesus Christ. An entire chapter of the Quran is devoted to the virgin birth of Jesus, and in actuality, Jesus is referred to more frequently than is Muhammad in the Quran. I am sure that the list you generated earlier includes the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm now going to go into a bit more detail so that we're sure we have those clear in our minds. Islam is organized around the 5 pillars, which are specific duties or obligations for all Muslims. They are written in the Sharia, which is the body of Islamic legal opinions. First of all is the Shahada, the confession. This is the requirement to witness to faith by reciting the confession, "There is no God but God," or Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, or the prophet of God. Practicing Muslims cite this several times daily. But it's important to note that Muhammad is seen as just one of a succession of prophets that revealed this message, of whom he is the culmination of that line of prophets, although it's essential to note that he is not considered divine. So that's the first of the 5 pillars of Islam, Shahada. The second is the Salat, the practice of daily prayer. The devout pray 5 times a day facing east, and it's a practice of adoration and submission to God that is woven through those prayers. Now, it's important to note that this is a ritual performance. It's a duty required by Islam. This is different than the idea of personal devotion, which is common in many Christian communities, although this kind of individual intercession is also practiced by many Muslims. The Salat consists of standing, kneeling, and prostrating oneself in the midst of the prayer practice. And the preference is to perform the Salat in the midst of other Islamic adherents, not by oneself alone. So that's the second pillar of Islam, the Salat. The third is the Zakat, which is almsgiving. Now, Zakat, interestingly, comes from the same word as to purity, or to purify. In this case, the act of purification is by giving alms to the poor, which serves as a means of exercising social responsibility, but is not seen in and of itself as a means to end poverty, but rather as a means to ease the effects of poverty. Third pillar, Zakat. The fourth is the Psalm, S-A-W-M, or in some transliterations, Siyam, S-I-Y-A-M. This is fasting during the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is determined by a lunar calendar, so it shifts in the course of the year, from year to year, and it requires fasting during the day, as I said, of the 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar. Now, this is a rigorous requirement. No food, no drink, no idle talk, no worldly pleasures from sun up to sundown for 30 years. And depending upon where you are in the globe or in what part of the season Ramadan falls on a given year, it can be more or less rigorous if you have very long days or very short days. For example, in a northern latitude or a southern latitude, that can vary greatly. The final pillar is the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca. Individuals in Islam are expected to take a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in the course of their lives, Mecca being the holy city of Islam. The practice actually predates the formal structure of Islam itself. Originally, it had been an annual pilgrimage to the Kaaba, literally the cube, an ancient center of worship. Mecca is understood to be the waterless valley where Abraham took his handmaid Hagar, who had given birth to Ishmael, and Abraham was throwing them out at the request of his wife Sarah, and left them to die in the desert. Abraham left Hagar and Ishmael to die. As Hagar, as the story is told, known as Hajarah, ran about looking for water to no avail, she returned to Ishmael, who was then an infant, to find a gurgling spring to have sprung where his heels kicked the desert sand. According to Islamic belief, Abraham, or Ibrahim, later returned, reunited with his son, and they together built the Kaaba on the site of the spring, which they called Zamzam. In 2003, 2.5 million Muslims made the Hajj. In the Hajj, men must dress in a simple white garment, and there are other strict limitations put on the practice of the Hajj. The Hajj cannot put you in debt. You must provide for your family while you are on the Hajj. And the taking of the Hajj cannot harm those you employ. And there are others, but those are some of the most significant. So again, that's the 5th pillar of Islam, the Hajj. Now, as we discuss Islam, it's important to know 2 principal tensions within the worldwide practice of Islam. The first is the idea of asabaya, and asabaya is spelled apostrophe A-S-A-B-I-Y-A, asabaya, which is the idea of tribe building. This is the local, insular, nation-building force that's expressed often in subgroups within Islam, defining the community, building your own group, and separating yourself from other groups. That's one tension within Islam, one theme. The second theme is that of the Ummah, U-M-M-A-H, which is a global universalizing force. The idea that there is one worldwide Islamic community that cannot be separated into subgroups. This would be a force and tension evident, for example, in the life of Malcolm X, who in his earlier career, when he was working with the Nation of Islam, would have been representative of the Asabaya. They were focused on creating a black-only Islamic community, tribe building, insular, that's the Asabaya. After his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, he came back realizing that the Islamic community was much larger, embracing people of many different racial identities, and so he began to epitomize the Ummah, the idea of the global, universalizing force of Islam. That's something to keep in mind as we do our reading and discussion, the tension between the Asabaya and the Ummah. Now, it's important to note that there is far more similarity between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam than there really are differences. In the worldwide context, there is far more difference between and among Christianity, Judaism and Islam, then there are differences. Let me note a couple of those similarities. All are monotheistic religions. They believe in only one God. All share a common Abrahamic tradition. They trace their roots back to the figure of Abraham. All focus on collective rituals where people gather together to express their religious fervor and their religious devotion. And all have practitioners who use their religion to support violent action. It's not unique to Christianity. It's not unique to Judaism. It's not unique to the practice of Islam. In fact, the only world religions to have done so are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to a large degree, because for the most part, religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism as religious systems haven't had that history of using their religion to support violent action. We could also contrast Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with non-theistic, non-deity-based religions like Buddhism that are more focused on enlightenment through meditation, or we could contrast the monotheistic religions that we've just named, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with a polytheistic tradition like Hinduism that invites engagement with a variety of deities. And we could again contrast these three religions of the book with, say, Confucianism, which is focused on principled conduct alone. When we put it in this contrasting environment, we see the ways in which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have far more in common than they do in difference. So it's ironic that there is so much tension between, in particular, Islam and Christianity, given that they're so closely associated. And yet the fact that they are so closely connected is also a reason that they may have conflicts. It's a little bit like two brothers who would otherwise be the best of friends if they weren't so much alike. We also need to discuss fundamentalisms that exist in Islam and in Judaism and Christianity. Some Islamic communities, like Jewish and Christian ones, seek to take the principles of their religious faith, in this case Islam, as found in the Sharia, and mandate them then through political power. This is a version of fundamentalist Islam that is not embraced by the majority of Islamic adherents in the world. When that fundamentalism does occur, it stems, as argued by Martin Marty and R. Scott Appleby, from a desire for order and stability, for identity and authenticity in a world of tension and instability in which adherents of a belief system often feel threatened by modern concepts of comparative religions, of postmodernism and relativism. And that fundamentalism is then often seen as a bulwark against those influences which are seen as a threat to true belief. We also need to talk about, when discussing Islam, the idea of gender separation. At the onset of puberty, often between 9 years and 11 years old, although some communities separate as early as at age 7, between 9 and 11 or as early as 7, boys and girls are socially separated. Girls attend parties only with other girls, for example. Boys join adult male sporting events. And concurrent with that social separation, women and men begin to take on Islamic duties of the Shahada, the confession, Salat, the daily prayer, Zakat, the giving of alms, Psalm fasting, and eventually the Hajj, the pilgrimage. With that as a general background, we can also discuss the theme of women and marriage in Islam. Women are limited to marrying only Muslim men, while men are generally allowed to marry women from the Christian and Jewish communities if they desire, although few actually end up doing so. If a woman in the Islamic community in the United States practices a profession, a lawyer, a doctor, etc., she is often not considered as desirable a marriage prospect because such a public role by a woman is frowned upon by many Islamic men. Divorced women are also considered ineligible for future marriage. Muslim men are reluctant to take on the financial obligations of children from previous marriage in many cases. So having discussed this, we can now turn our attention to the dynamics of the hijab. So what is the hijab in this context? Think about what your ideas are. I won't ask you to write them down there, but just take a moment to ponder when you think of a hijab, the veiling that is often associated with traditional Islamic women, what ideas come to mind? Do we think immediately of oppression of women? Do we think of women being put in secondary status? Do we think about limits being put on women? Or do we think about it as a way for devotion to be expressed, as a way to identify oneself as the community? Well, let's look at these multivalences, these many meanings that are present within the Islamic community around the hijab. First, a sociological perspective on veiling itself more generally. Like all clothing, veiling serves a cultural purpose because clothing is never just functional. It always denotes status, gender, occupation, sometimes religious affiliation, political identity. It can denote age, your ethnicity even. At times, the powerful use clothing to maintain their status. For example, think of the example of a requirement that an African American maid or cook in a white household wear a uniform. That's a means of establishing superior and inferior status. At other times, the powerless can use clothing to subvert or challenge the established order. Consider, for example, the hip-hop artist who sags his pants. He's sending a message of nonconformity, for example, to white norms and standards. A little bit of historical background on the veil. Originally, the veil was considered a sign of economic and status prestige. In the Assyrian, Greco-Roman, and Byzantine empires, as well as in pre-Islamic Iran, women who were secluded and veiled did not have to perform manual labor and so were considered more respectable. Only wealthy families could afford to seclude women in their midst. It was not until the beginning of the 20th century that the veil was associated with the oppression of women, but it quickly took on that aspect in modernity. Now, there have been very early on noted instances of challenging the perceived sexism of the veil, such as in the 1923 incident when the Egyptian feminist Huda Sharawi was returning from an international feminist meeting in Rome and drew the veil back from her face when she got off the train. It was a dramatic moment, drew lots of attention. Likewise, in 1936, Reza Shah of Iran abolished the veil in that context. Interestingly and literally, the hijab means modesty in all actions, one's demeanor, one's words, how one looks at someone else. And in that sense, it's applied to both women and men. How one covers up both women and men. And according to Islamic law, both women and men are supposed to wear clothing that is loose and covers them from the neck all the way down to the ankles. Women are also supposed to cover their hair. Now, in the US, there's a wide variety of interpretations and adherence to the hijab among women, ranging from those who wear the hijab to those who only do so on select occasions, to those who do only for religious observances. And there are some who never do. In general, African American members of Islam, as a group, seem to be more strict in their observance of the wearing of the hijab than other American Islamic female adherents. We're going to now see a short clip from Islam in America that shows the experience of one young woman as she is dealing with the wearing of the hijab.
Wearing the hijab is Uzma's point of non-negotiation.
I've never considered not wearing it because of work. I've always felt that this is who I am. It's a part of my identity. It's not something I'm willing to compromise for a job, nor should I have to.
Though she didn't have strict parents, Uzma decided to wear hijab whilst at law school.
Hijab is something that's so difficult because for some reason people look at women in hijab and they automatically think she must be oppressed, someone's forcing her to wear that. And for some reason people can't understand how it could be a choice that someone makes on their own, how it could not be imposed on them. And one of the things that I find about American society is that there are Western notions of female beauty I find to be extremely oppressive to women. There's all these industries, the cosmetics industry, for example, the plastic surgery industry, fashion, modeling, and this idea that women, to be beautiful, must be thin. They have to be young. They have to, wear makeup, or even to have a natural look, you have to wear lip gloss.
There are other matters of principle too. In the privacy of her own office, Uzma always finds time to fit in her daily prayers.
Let's take a few more minutes to discuss additional aspects of the hijab. In the home environment, women who cover themselves in public through the hijab are allowed free rein to move about without veiling in that home setting. Windows are covered to protect those on the outside from seeing women unveiled at home. But in the presence of visitors, traditional garb is again put on and women again conform to specific gender roles. Now, the public presentation of women who wear the hijab assumes that they are absent from official proceedings and totally submissive to the men of the community and never speak in public. That public image, however, needs to be considered alongside issues of how women deal with wearing the hijab. There's more going on than it actually meets the eye. Because the veil is a multivalent object. It has multiple meanings in multiple settings. So for instance, there are contemporary commercials in the Islamic world that deliberately use the wearing of the hijab to denote religious purity, even in an ad, for example, by Kotex for feminine hygiene products. The veil in that context counters the impurity of a woman's menstrual period as understood by members of that community. It connotes that by the wearing of the hijab, women can, in short, avoid being impure. So that's one interesting interpretation of the veil. In some settings, particularly with white Western men, the veil is seen as an erotic object. It's used in advertisements for commodities as diverse as Jeep Cherokees and desktop computers. And the veil also shows up regularly in the pages of Playboy, Hustler, Penthouse magazines to not only eroticize Middle Eastern women, but also to mock and stereotype practices of Middle Eastern people. So that's a second valence, meaning of the hijab. The veil is also used as a symbol of authenticity to convince potential buyers of the traditional value of, for example, Middle Eastern food, which is similar in some ways to the bandana head covering of an Aunt Jemima, a racist African-American symbol, that's used to sell syrup, for example. The use of the object, this religious object or this cultural object, to make something authentic and therefore more attractive to a buyer. Now, some Muslim women have used the veil to open up space for their participation in new venues. How does that work? Well, for example, some women have ventured into public space to practice a profession, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a teacher, even while singling, even though they're taking on this new traditionally male role, they're going to remain devout. So it gives them some protection as they push other boundaries. Some Nation of Islam women, for example, have used also the veil to protect themselves from male harassment and attention. By covering up, they defeat the male gaze. Likewise, at points, the veil has been used to resist arranged marriages and patriarchal influences, while continuing to wear the veil and thus again counter accusations that they are not faithful. So if a father would say, this is the man you're going to marry, and the daughter says, no, I'm not, and he might accuse her of therefore not being a faithful adherent of Islam, but she says, yes, I am. Look, I'm wearing this veil. Also, Sunni Muslim women have increasingly used their membership in Islam to assert that Quran demands the fair treatment of women. Look at me, I'm a faithful adherent, I wear the hijab, but the Quran is saying you have to be fair with women. You cannot abuse us or misuse us. The scholar Carolyn Moxley Rouse has also shown that African American women who join Islam, and indeed this is the case for other women from other racial groups as well, that African American women who join Islam remain engaged and don't give up on their agency even when they agree to wear the veil. They may choose to be quiet or acquiesce, but they then might express their agency through the study of the Quran, through developing expertise in proper piety, for example, the proper way to wear a hijab, something that men have little or no knowledge of, as the scholar Sabah Mahmood has pointed out. Thus, women have created a space where men cannot exercise authority that they think they have over the women, because the women are the experts on how to wear the hijab. The men don't know how to do that, so the women are the ones who are exercising authority there. So even by accepting the hijab, they are actually increasing their agency. So it's a question to consider. Is this really a form of resistance? Are people just making it up? Is this the way people are using a religious object that's been traditionally defined as putting women in second-class status to increase their agency rather than decrease it? It's something to think about. A few more comments before we finish today. We do want to note some differences between immigrant and African American Muslim women. In contemporary settings, it's a common pattern that African American Muslim women receive more hostility from outsiders than do immigrant Muslim women. Why is this the case? Why is someone who'd been part of the United States for generations be seen more as a threat as someone who's just come from outside the United States? Well, one possible explanation is this may be seen as a threat to the Judeo-Christian-centric society, or as an implicit critique of the racism of the society by a member of the community who's seen as being part of the community, not choosing to follow that Judeo-Christian path, and recognizing the importance of a new one. There's also a growing sense that immigrant Muslim men are increasing the secondary status of African American Muslim women. Some Muslim women have begun to speak out and critique the segregation in mosques and the shunning that occurs within the African American community when a woman reports domestic abuse. Now, there are also tensions have emerged as African American Muslims feel that immigrant Muslims are treating them as second-class citizens within the context of the practice of Islam, even though Islam has been practiced in the United States for centuries, and African American Muslims know that U.S. context intimately. African American Muslims often feel that immigrant Muslims assume that those immigrant Muslims are the true spokespersons for Islam and ignore the history of racism in the United States. So all this is to say that there's a complex process going on, negotiating between new entries to the U.S. who have been long practitioners of Islam and African Americans in the U.S. who have also been long practitioners of Islam but are seen as second-class practitioners, often by those immigrants coming into the United States. Now, we do need to note that in our present political context, the question of immigration and presence in the United States and the practicing of Islam has taken on new political controversy because of, in some people's minds, the association, inaccurate association, of Islam with terrorism. The analogy has often been made that we can no more associate Islam with terrorism than we can Christianity with terrorism, unless we're going to say that members of the KKK are truly representative of all Christians, and therefore, as practitioners of terrorism, they need to be seen as, then Christianity needs to be seen as a terrorist religion. Both the analogies are incorrect. There are many different practitioners of Islam, some who use violence and the majority who don't, and the same would be the same for Christianity and Judaism. Thanks again for your attention.